So you may or may not know this, but originally Rose McClarney was supposed to read tonight as well. You may or may not know there may be some influential members among you who alerted you to the fact that she has a new book out. But I thought since she couldn't be here and was supposed to be here, I would start with one of her poems.
She will be here in February.
She will be here in February. Maybe she'll read this poem and you can decide who read it better. I think there will be some tie-ins with this poem, which is from her newest book. What I'm going to read, so maybe we'll have a quiz at the end to see if you can find the connections. So I'm just going to read one of her poems just in her absence, called The Way Taken. A waterfall impedes travel and mountains slows. A straight line measures of mileage between points tells little of how a walker really moved over land's features. We are unable to fly. What humans can choose is not to cross streams or ridges in a straight shot, though the distance would be lesser if swum or clambered. I live in Henderson County, and if I could have gone straight across the mountain, it would have taken me about 35 minutes to get there. Usually we've gone around, on the route at a hill's feet, or that kept our own dry, followed least cost pathways, archaeologists term, referring to where past pedestrians accounting for terrain are likely to have stepped. What is cost? In 1000 AD, perhaps the people who lived here preferred length of effort to force. Perhaps time rather than exertion was the currency with which they, with their trails winding slow and level through the valleys and meadows, paid. What is we? Settlers who spoke of taking the long, crooked road, migrating to the mountains are the lineage I come closest to claiming. They picked dirt so rocky it bent tools, wouldn't yield food, and stayed, as if to choose dramatic scenery was to set beauty as the highest value. But hard labor is as central to their story, in which some estimation of profit led to plowing native mounds in a few generations, wearing them down to half the height they've been for 1,000 years. To displacements more terrible still, and to me, learning to take my first steps on disturbed ground, then pocketing pottery shards I found, to encounter again later, opening boxes of childhood collections and questions about my and first, acquire and know. At home, like anywhere, cheaper has come to mean the closest spot for constructing the parking lot. Ease, bulldozers filling streams and wetlands, laying mounds and mountains low, and overpaved plateaus spreading out around chain stores. I roll a rattling cart holding whatever purchase I could afford. Though I also spend evenings tracing connections between ancient sites and archaeologists' maps of my home county, studying their conjectures of the hours a Mississippian would have to have given to walk to each village in the town center, figuring in which places it would cost more than a day's time to arrive. I pictured dwelling uphill, upriver, where others might tire before reaching to deliver hard news at a remove that far. And I think there may be some for sale back there. City Lights has been nice enough to come over and sell some books this evening. So as Susan said, my name is Jeremy. I teach at Western. And I'm going to read from my book, Bear Wallow, and then a new book whose title we're currently fighting over that will be out sometime next year. And I think all that you really need to know before I kind of dive into these excerpts, and hopefully we'll have some time for a conversation, is that my family, nearly all the branches of it are in Henderson County, and that's where I was raised. And my dad's family's land that I was raised on is sort of 100 acres stretched out on this side of the creek. My mom's family's land stretches out across that creek. So I was kind of a feral child who could just be let loose because I couldn't really get beyond family land. And my grandma would go out to her car, reach in the window, and blow the horn 3 times when we were supposed to come home. That was our homing beacon. When I was a teenager, though, I used to cut through the woods and go down to my great-great-grandparents' house. And it was empty, but still standing, and I would sit on the porch and, think angsty teenager thoughts. And at some point I realized when I walked up the hill and looked across the creek and saw the cemetery, the community cemetery, where pretty much all of my people were buried, I realized this was a pretty terrifying prospect. You know, my family had lived on one patch of land for generations and then been laid to rest in that same patch of land for eternity, and I was like, I gotta get out of here. It felt like, you know, when you're 17, you know everything, and it felt like life was happening somewhere else. You know, this couldn't be it, what I could see around me. And so I was determined to leave, and really to get, you know, kind of as far away as I could, and not because things were bad, but just because I was sure there was more happening somewhere else. And so this is how smart that I was. I moved to Honduras, and in escaping my small mountain town, I moved to a small mountain town, which I was sure would be totally different. So I'm going to read from a couple of just sections at the beginning of Bearwallow. One of those starts in Honduras. I was living in a town called Gracias that sits at the base of the Cloud Forest, the tallest mountain in Honduras. And I think all you need to know is that I was teaching 4th grade, and my girlfriend at the time was also there teaching. It was in Gracias, leading 4th graders through cobblestone streets and across the snaking rivers, that I somehow found myself working back to Bearwallow. Does anybody know Bearwallow Mountain in Henderson County? If you've ever driven through Henderson County, especially if you've driven to Chedney Rock or through Fairview, it's the tallest peak, and it's a kind of bald peak, so it's noticeable. And I grew up kind of at the base of it. I began to see traces of home everywhere. At first, it was only the land. The sweeping mountains of western Honduras, while a bit more jagged and lush than the Blue Ridge, felt immediately reminiscent of home. Cousins to the mountains I'd left. Their age, soft presence backed every step of my daily life. Then random moments tripped my brain and pointed it toward the mountains. Uncovering local folk songs with my students had me digging out similarities in Appalachian tunes. Hearing ghost stories of men on the mountain made me think of my forefathers. Leading my students to search after a fabled enormous snake living inside the mountain moved me to recall the mythical bear I always pictured patrolling Bearwallow's Peak. I even began to pick out qualities in the people that turned my head toward home. It was as if I'd found some sort of wide-reaching mountainness. The constantly private and kind nature of the locals felt akin to the manner of the people of western North Carolina, as if the history of mountain survival shaped generations and daily interactions, as if the harshness and isolation of wrinkled, towering land led people to distrust the outside and forced them to rely on community. These people, it seemed, were my people. Some mornings in the 1st grade classroom at the elementary school, I passed around white sheets of paper along with our basket of broken and half-naked crayons so the students could draw while I collected myself in front of the room. Nearly all of them reached in for the green first, starting a few feuds. They aligned their pages on their desks, and then with crooked, sharp lines, they pulled the crayons up and down and up and down along the top of the whiteness. Nothing was added to the page until the mountain stood firmly in the backdrop. It was impulse. We hadn't spoken about representing the physical parts of the world around us. I was just trying to keep them busy while I pieced together lesson plans. But the mountains were always first, as if the children were born knowing of the land's longevity and history. The mountains spread as a green outline across the entire piece of paper, always mountains before houses, before mothers and fathers, before the students' round-headed, long-armed representations of themselves. It was a strange image to witness. A room full of Honduran children hunched over their papers and wobbly wooden desks, scratching thick green lines into an empty world. So while I was in Honduras, I started thinking more and more of home. And I started thinking particularly of a moment in college. I went to college really in the middle of North Carolina, but it was at a private school that was mostly full of people from the Northeast, and so it felt like a very different world from where I had grown up. And I kept thinking back to this moment that happened a few years before, and so I want to read from that section. A few years before landing in Honduras, Sarah, who was my girlfriend at the time, and I had set out from my university for lunch one day. We stopped in the parking lot of a grocery store to get money from an ATM. And as we did, I noticed the hood of my car coughing smoke. I pulled forward, the car jerked and stopped, the smoke a final sigh. I remember climbing out into the half-full parking lot and cringing at the irony of being broken down in my college town. Both of my grandfathers, with their bare high school educations, could likely have fixed the car, or at least diagnosed the problem. All I knew to do was open the hood and look around. But I could talk about Faulkner and iambic pentameter. A man eventually stopped to help us, and he hopped from his muddy truck with his 2 young children in tow. He bid us hello and immediately bent down, reaching in to touch the green goo pooling beneath the car. "Your radiator's busted," he announced, standing back up, wiping the green on his jeans. He sent his son to fill a jug with water next door at a bank, as Sarah and I stood by the steaming car in the middle of a parking lot in the middle of North Carolina. "Where are y'all from?" he asked. "Henderson County," I said, "farther west." "Oh, so y'all's mountain folk." We nodded, slowly, unsurely. "Mountain folks, good people," he said. Despite hailing from the Blue Ridge, I had never considered that any qualities could make me mountain folk, that geology had affected my personal characteristics or shaped me in any kind of way. It seemed such a curious notion. If the land had marked me somehow, I didn't know how. I started wondering if others knew me to be mountain folk from my walk, or gestures, or tongue. Was I good people because of plate tectonics? In Honduras, the voice of that Good Samaritan mechanic crept back into my head over and over. "So y'all's mountain folk." In that foreign world, I easily spotted how the mountains rub the people. They'd been shaped by life there in the highlands. I heard it in their voices, I saw it in their eyes, but I couldn't do the same with myself. How was I marked? How was I mountain people? How was I my people? So after digging in and planting roots at the edge of Gracias a Dios, Sarah and I decided to pack it in, return to the Blue Ridge. I took a job at Eddyville Elementary School. Sarah and I married, moved into a small house off Gillum Road, dead in the view of Bearwater Mountain. So I moved back home, really with that question. I think that question drives the book, is what does it mean to be a mountain person? And so one of the ways that I decided to answer that question was to buy a banjo. That felt like the most obvious thing I could do. If I want to be a mountain person, I should learn how to play the banjo. And so I bought a banjo. The other thing that's alluded to in that section that I did was I took a job at an elementary school. That elementary school happened to be the elementary school I attended. All of my teachers were still there, kindergarten through 5th grade. So the year proved to be a kind of time machine. You know, I was in the same school with the same women who now wanted me to call them by their first names. And I was teaching the so-called newcomer students, the students who had, you know, maybe a week prior to coming to my classroom, which is a trailer in the back, had been living, you know, in Mexico or Central America, across town. So newly arrived students. At the same time, I'm trying to figure out where I am. I'm trying to teach them where they've arrived to. So I bought this banjo. I decided I wanted to learn how to play a sort of pre-bluegrass style of banjo, which, if you know much about the banjo, it kind of falls into this larger umbrella of old-time music. The banjo playing is sometimes called clawhammer or frailing, and like I said, it kind of predates bluegrass music. And so I started learning these really old songs because it felt like, yes, this is how I'll figure out that I'm a mountain person. So I started learning songs like this. And I was like, yeah, that feels right. If anyone knows that song, though, I learned later that there are lyrics. And so the chorus goes a little bit like this. Lord forgive us, Lord protect us. We've been drinking whiskey before breakfast. And that was a little disconcerting. And as I started kind of learning more and more songs, there was a theme, which was even more disconcerting because I had set the banjo up as this way of sort of this reciprocal relationship that the banjo is the mountains and I have now become the mountains. And I was like, wait, so many of these songs are about drinking and killing. I don't know what that means about me now. The other thing that you probably know is that the banjo is sometimes called an American instrument because in some ways it took shape here, unlike so many other instruments. But really, it's an African instrument that was shaped largely by enslavement. So it is in some ways very American in that way because it has a really loaded history, but was sort of stretched out and got this weird like half string situation that happened, in America. And so even though at first I was like, well, maybe that's not such a good representation of what it is to be American and what it is to be mountain. In the end, I think it is because it's a hodgepodge of a thing. It's sort of a mess, right? And so much of our history is. But I thought I would play a drinking and a killing song just to set the mood. So there are lots of, the Whiskey Before Breakfast song is really an Irish song. But this song is called Old Plank Road. And I think instead of being a drinking song, it's really like a song of temperance. I think the thesis here is that if you drink too much, you will either end up in jail or married. Those are the two possible scenarios. So here's how it goes. I'd rather be in Richmond with all the hail and rain than to be in Georgia, boy, wearing that ball and chain. I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, way down the old plank road. Donny, oh dear Donny, why do you treat me so? Forced me to wear that ball and chain and now my ankle's sore. I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, way down the old plank road. Knoxville is a pretty place, Memphis is a beauty. Love to see the pretty girls hop to Chattanooga. Won't get drunk no more, won't get drunk no more, won't get drunk no more, way down the old plank road. A lot of these old tunes have like 17 verses. I'll just play one more, but this one's my favorite. My wife died Friday night, Saturday she was buried. Sunday was my court day, Monday I got married. I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, I won't get drunk no more, way down the old plank road. And there's of course a long tradition of murder ballads in Appalachian music. They too tend to have a moral. The murderer doesn't usually end up in good shape at the end. But it's a genre unto itself. So I thought I'd play one murder ballad. If you know anything about the banjo, the joke is that you spend half the time tuning, the other half playing out of tune. So this is a song called Wild Bill Jones. And I think in this one he's sort of killing out of, I don't know, he's trying to defend what he feels like is his. Well, I went out to take a walk. I come upon a Wild Bill Jones. He was walking and talking about my true love side. I begged him for to leave her alone. Well, old Wild Bill Jones, he was a very bad man. He carried 2 guns and a knife. So I pulled my revolver out from my side, destroyed that poor boy's life. Well, I've been all around this whole wide world. I've been down to Memphis, Tennessee. Well, that day was the last of old Wild Bill Jones. Tomorrow'll be the last of me. My favorite part of that song, though, is that he's been everywhere, even Memphis, Tennessee. So the banjo, in some ways, I said, became not the cleanest way of understanding what it means to be a mountain person. But I did, it's not all drinking and killing, obviously. I learned a lot about the history of this region through old banjo tunes. There are lots of railroad songs, right, about the change that happened here, which involve things coming in, but a lot of people leaving, right? There are all these songs of homesickness and people leaving. I learned a lot about communities, but also a lot about nature. There are lots of bird songs, right? And so the banjo did, in some ways, become a kind of history lesson into the region. Because when I moved back here, I don't know about you, if those of you who grew up in this region, the word Appalachian was not a word that I ever used, really, unless I was talking about a college that we won't name. But I didn't identify in that way. It wasn't a way that I sort of thought of myself. And so when I came back, I really learned, or figured out I had a lot more to learn about where I was from, and so I kind of dove in. So this book kind of asks that question. One of the connections to Rose's poem that I read in the beginning is that what that meant for me is that Bear Wallow Mountain, which had been a place that I rode my bike to the top of. It felt like a kind of eternal place. There were cattle on top, and that was about it. And it's this sort of bald peak, so it felt like it could be today, or it could have been 150 years ago. Like that spot's going to be the same. When I came back from Honduras, cycled up it for the first time, I saw the beginnings of this, 100-home development that was soon to be raised up on the peak. And so one of the central questions of the book, I think, is, how are we shaped by our place, but then also, how do we shape that place? What does it mean to then put our hands in it and change it? And there is a kind of circular, relationship there. So if we change the place, it's also changing us. So I became really interested in these questions of land and how we use it and what it might do to us to change that. The hardcover version of this book has some photos in the middle. When the publisher asked me to go find some photos that we might put in the book, I, of course, went to my grandma's house and said, can I look at some old pictures? And so I was, at that time, not living home anymore, and I came back, took that trail through the woods, down to her house, and I found more than pictures. And so I want to read to you from a section of the new book about that first visit to Grandma's house. It was dark when I sat at Grandma's dining table looking through old pictures. I'd come through the woods, taking the trail we'd worn as kids from my house, the Yellow Brick Road, we called it. In truth, it's hard to know if we'd worn that trail or if it predated us. In those woods, who could ever know if we created a path or simply taken up a line already cut there by our fathers or grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather? And really, who's to say that the lay of the land didn't pull us all where we were going to go anyway? If every path in that forest wasn't predestined by the plates never quite settling underfoot. By then, I'd moved away from the land that raised me, but I was back home, visiting my parents, and I set off to Grandma's after supper, past the lilting tractor shed, the abandoned beagle pens, and the rusted-out mill saw, to hunt through her boxes, searching for old family photographs. I sat, and Grandma stood over my shoulder, leaning on her walker, her husband, she'd call it, and we worked through a box holding piles upon piles of photographs. I learned quickly there was no system for the stacks rubber banded together or stacked in corners. Few of them carried dates or names. The whole box started to feel like a memory. Flashes of images, emotional responses, but hardly any method to the madness. We settled into a routine quickly. I fished out a photo. She called out the names of faces I would never recognize. Oh, that's your granddaddy's second cousin. As I made notes and stacked the photos on the tables, she reached in past me, lifted out a yellow newspaper clipping buried beneath Christmas cards and matching families and Polaroid photos of camping trips. She scanned the page and then held it in front of me like a handkerchief. Look here. I took what turned out to be a 1979 article from the nearby Asheville Citizen-Times titled, "Secret Journals Yield Honest Picture of WNC." I set in, reading about the discovery of diaries written by a 19th century man characterized as, quote, an intellectual, a naturalist, a mathematician, and a tireless lover. He, quote, kissed the girls all over Western North Carolina during the course of his lifetime, the article opened, but he was true to the gentleman's code. He didn't tell. The story detailed the recorded life of a man who could read Greek and Latin and who, quote, loved a good time and a willing woman, end quote. I enjoyed a tattered and salacious local news story as much as anyone, but it did feel strange to read about century-old sex affairs with the grandma who once drove me to vacation Bible school over my shoulder. I finished and handed it back to her with an eyebrow raised and a smile saying, well, that was something. I ready to dig back into the photos. He was one of ours, she said, looking before I could turn back to the box. My great-great-granddaddy. So the moral of that story, I think more than anything, is that you have to believe your grandmas. I left her house saying there's no way that man who kept those salacious diaries was her great-great-grandfather. I've written this book, I've been digging around for family stories for, at that point, many years. Never had she told me about this. But here was this newspaper clipping, that was 35, 40 years old, waiting in that box. So the shortest version of the story that I can tell you is that in about 1975, a house in Wadesboro, North Carolina, was abandoned and kind of languishing, and the city decided it was time to level it. The woman who had lived there, a retired school teacher, had been dead for 6 years, and the house was in kind of rough shape. So naturally, they kind of pulled all of her belongings and everything out and readied the wrecking ball. As everything was out on the sidewalk, a man came by, and I don't know exactly what caught his attention, but there were 27 handmade notebooks stacked and waiting there. And he could tell they were old. They were hand-sewn, small little notebooks. And so he picked them up, opened them up, had no idea what he was looking at because it looks like hieroglyphics. They're just symbols and symbols and symbols. And so he didn't know what it was, but he knew that it was old and maybe valuable, and so he took it with him and left, and they, raised the house. He spent many years trying to figure out what he had. He went to historical societies, he went to libraries, he scanned pages and mailed them off to organizations, and nobody knew or really cared what this was, and he got a lot of kind of silence back. Finally, after 3 years, he met an archivist in Raleigh, the state archivist, whose name was George Stevenson, and he showed them to him. He said, I don't know what these are either, but I know a guy. And Stevenson had known an NSA cryptanalyst who had retired to Hayesville, North Carolina, where the man's wife was from. He said, why don't we copy some pages, mail them to him, and just see what it might be. So they Xeroxed a few pages. This was 1978. Mailed them to him, left a note inside that said something like, we don't know if these are astrological observations or something else entirely, and just sent them away. The man, Nathaniel Browder, who had been an NSA analyst, had been a cryptanalyst, so he had broken code for the government for most of his career. It took him about 30 minutes to break all symbol substitution code. And he saw those few pages, broke the code. And what he found there was the life of a 19th century man that was recorded, once you deciphered it pretty plainly. There wasn't a lot of artifice. He's just sort of laying it out there. And Browder was retired and interested in history and decided he would drive the 6 hours across the state, paid $35 for all the diaries, came back home and spent the next 6-7 years deciphering and transcribing these diaries. So I found out about them when I pulled that news, or my grandma pulled that newspaper clipping out of the box. But the world found out about them in around 1978, 1979, when he first started transcribing them. I decided I wanted to find a copy. Browder made about 75 copies of his transcription, sent them to regional libraries. I have some of his notes in which he tried to get it published. He tried to get Western to publish it, and they said no. He tried to get someone to publish it. No one would, so he made 75 copies himself, mailed them out. I found someone selling one on Amazon for $79.99, so I bought it. At the time, we were living in Charleston, and it arrived to my house maybe a week before I found out that my wife was pregnant with our first child. until these two events kind of align, one clearly more important than the other, but they kind of entangled in a way. And so I'll just read a little section about what I sort of encountered when I first started looking at the diaries. I read the decoded diaries as our baby grew inside Sarah, our genes stretching out to give shape to a new life, copies of us coding someone who was not us. I carried the transcript in my bag to and from the small college where I taught, pulling it out in empty office hours or after dinner to open to a random page and search for any curiosity there. I flipped through the diaries like one might a magazine in a waiting room, basically just looking for dirty words. But in the winter, satisfied I'd found all the dirty words I could, I started reading the diaries in earnest, chronologically. I first found William at age 20, love-struck and confused, and I followed him to his grave at age 70. During those 50 years, he wrote everything and nothing. Every day of his life, he whittled down to a line or two, went to meeting, earned as much space as mother died. He offered no reflection, no introspection, little context or defense. He simply logged his life, or what he thought was important about his life, in short form. Across those pages, I saw flashes of history I learned in high school blurring by in the background. The War of 1812 looms and then passes. Cherokee families are hauled into camps in 1838. He attends Frankie Silver's execution. I should say, too, in 1827, he was commissioned with a man named Reuben Beaver to come to Macon County and make the first survey of Macon County. Franklin was surveyed in 1820 by Colonel Love, but when Macon County broke off from Haywood County, Prestwood was hired to come and map that. I thought about reading that section and I was like, they know all this stuff already. That would not even be interesting. But it was obviously a complicated thing because it had just, been Cherokee land a decade prior. He attends Frankie Silver's funeral, but what was foregrounded across the 200 pages was a man tending land and searching for life. And then it happened. Sometime in the winter, the diaries were no longer simply a distraction or an oddity, no longer a Where's Waldo of bedroom words. Amid the white space and unspoken narratives, a man took shape, a man from whom I descended. When I read the pages, I saw him. When I left the pages, he came with me. He took up residence in my brain as I took residence in his passed-on life, and he was real. So, because I spent so much time in these diaries, and because he was so honest, he wasn't really writing these for anyone, I felt like I was coming to know this person who, died in 1859. So, really lived in a completely different world than I did. But I carry his DNA, and I felt like there was something to learn from that. I should say that I, had become a father, and I wasn't sleeping much. And so these really existential questions felt really loaded and big because I was thinking about fatherhood and legacy and inheritance and all these things getting passed on, while also considering what I've inherited from this complicated man. And so I set out to learn more about him. And the way the book works is that it kind of moves back and forth between his life and my life. And so I'll read just one section, which really is from his first entry, kind of retelling his story. And then maybe we'll just kind of chat something there. William Thomas Prestwood is his name. Spends much of the vernal equinox of 1808 pulling a cow from a bog. He is 20 and has decided it is time to make something of his life. All across Darlington County, seeds are finding purchase, the air heavy and wet, and perhaps William has been imagining those fields turning green in a matter of weeks, thinking about his grandfather's ever-dividing land, or about his own drunk father, about the thinness of human life, thinking about everything changing or nothing changing. The truth is, some of this life change decision has to do with his sister, forever nagging him to take hold of something, to quit floating and reading and thinking, to become a man. The truth is also that some of this life change decision has to do with love, with the tight-chested version of himself he becomes around Mary Norwood. Today, in the mud, pushing on a cow, it has been more than a week since he last saw Mary Norwood, and that exchange had not gone well. It was Sunday, and he rode with her brother Alex to the church meeting, and when they set out for home, Alex walked with Mary, rather than mounting his horse. William tried to keep pace with them on horseback, but it was difficult. Finally, he asked Mary to climb on, to ride behind them so they could all carry on their way. This was only logical. Why should she and Alex amble along beside a perfectly capable horse? But William may have also been thinking of how he'd look with Mary Norwood, a woman, 6 years his elder, gripping his waist, hair trailing behind them both as they made their way home in the Sunday sun. She'd rather walk, she said. And so began William's recorded life. Later that day, in his first entry, he recounted the rest of the ride home. March 13th, 1808. I kept up conversation when I could. After a while, I said, as I can't be of no service to you, I will go. Repented for my awkward conduct. The next day, he plotted out the possible trajectories for his life. March 14th. Rise, reflected on yesterday's conduct. I swore I would alter my station of life, provoked to it by my sister. Determined one plan of 3 to be executed, vis-a-vis either marry Mary Norwood, keep Bachelor's Hall, or travel. 3 possible futures scribbled in ink: teach, travel, or take the hand of Mary Norwood. Pull her up onto his horse and rush through the fields, the world turning green in their wake as they charged toward the coast, his parents, arm in arm, looking happy for once, waving goodbye. Of course he chooses Mary. Mary will become his life. He set it in ink, and so he is knee-deep in a bog on a Tuesday with a mud-stuck cow belonging to her father. He is putting in work. The next day, William hauls this curried favor to Mr. Norwood's shop to find Mary, to start his new life. March 15th. Thought to spark Miss Mary Norwood, but my Uncle C.C. was there. Did not do it. No matter the finality of his plans on paper, what becomes clear in the living world is that it is easier for William to push a cow from a bog than it is to carry on a conversation with the woman he loves. Oozing with awkward conduct, William avoids Mary for weeks, eventually deciding to court her where he is comfortable, alone and writing. March 27th. Burnt a letter. Started to meet him. Did not talk to Mary Norwood. She looked cross-eyed. Come home to sleep. March 28th. Skinned Mr. Norwood's cow. Put out the fire at night. March 29th. In the morning, hauled rails. Mother started the grandfathers. I went to writing a letter to Mary Norwood. Alarmed by fire, subdued it. Went to writing. Fire alarm, subdued it. Rode a while, went around the fire, finished sleeping, finished writing, slept. March 30th, sent the letter to Miss Mary Norwood. The whole of William's life now hangs on a letter written in fits over 2 days, and then he waits. He works on the road, he visits his grandfather, he buys a gun. April 3rd, slept late, heard that Mary Norwood had received my letter on Thursday, did not return. Had toothache. So, William's philandering, in some ways, I would blame on Mary Norwood. She leads him on for a year, and then he finally gives up, and he goes carousing, as he says, and the rest is kind of history. I thought maybe we can I'll take some questions, we could sing one song together, maybe? This is an easy one. You may know, Doc Watson did a version of it that's pretty popular. As a lot of these songs go, there's a lot of repetition, so you'll catch on, but it's called My Home's Across the Blue Ridge Mountains. The chorus says, My Home's Across the Blue Ridge Mountains 3 times. And then it says, and I never expect to hear you anymore. Sorry, never expect to see you anymore. So that's the part we'll all join in. If you catch on anywhere else, feel free to grab on and go. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I never expect to see you anymore. How can I keep from crying? How can I keep from crying? How can I keep from crying? But I never expect expect to see you anymore. My home's across the Ridgeland. My home's across the Ridgeland Mountains. My home's across the Ridgeland, and I never expect to see you anymore. I'm going back to North Carolina. I'm going back to North Carolina. I'm going back to North Carolina, and I never expect to see you anymore. All right, everybody. My home's across the Ridgeland Mountains. My home's across the Ridgeland Mountains. My home's across the Ridgeland Mountains, and I never expect to see you anymore. All right, good singing. So we have a few minutes if there's any questions or tomatoes or whatever. Yes?
Did you teach in Charleston?
I did, yeah. I taught at a small liberal arts college there for 5 years. Yeah.
When's the book coming out?
Summer of 2025. Yeah.
What's the title?
Good question. I'll just tell you, just to put you on my side. So the title that I handed over to the publisher was The Coded Life. Because as you might imagine, a lot of the book ends up being about DNA codes and sort of what we inherit and what we pass on. I don't know what publishers do. They give things to booksellers and they run numbers and analytics. Now, I don't really know. Sorry, I'm turning myself off here. They said people thought the book was about computers when I heard the title. I was like, oh no, that's probably not good. But I don't know if that's true. But people think the color purple is about purple. I don't know. Other questions? Yeah.
So why did your great-great-great-grandfather write in code, and how did he even learn
Yeah.
code?
I don't know. I mean, a lot of this book is kind of filling in the gaps. The things I do know are that he had a complicated relationship with his father, who was a Revolutionary War veteran and who liked to drink. And he writes when William is about 20, 21, his father bursts into his room at midnight looking for gin. William gets really mad at him and says, I told him one roof would not hold us both if he'd do as he done again. And the next day he creates his cipher. So I wondered if he was trying to keep something from his father. He also, as you know, I sort of alluded to, I didn't want to drop any four-letter words here tonight, but he has a lot of women that he ends up writing about, and I wondered if he was trying to keep that hidden. He has different symbols for his different women. And so those are my two guesses, to keep something from his father and to keep his affairs kind of secret.
And are you putting any of the code in the book?
Yes. Best laid plans. I had this vision initially that I was going to slowly drop in bits of code throughout the book so that at the end I could write a section in code and the reader would be able to decipher it. Which sounds great, right? But then everybody who's read it, they're like, you cannot, that's not. But I have a cousin who's a bit of a math brain, and he wrote a program for me so that I can type in plain text and it converts it to William's cipher. So I'll probably make that available in some form. But there are bits of code in there, but I don't teach it to the reader along the way. Yeah.
How did he get over being shy?
It's a good question. I mean, it's a really interesting. So Browder, who's the cryptanalyst who decoded the book, he doesn't editorialize a lot. But one thing that's clear to me from his notes and a few things he says here and there are that he really, I think, felt a kinship with Prestwood because Prestwood was a tinkerer. You know, he was like dissecting rabbits sometimes, and he invents tools, and he could sort of just do everything. And I think the cryptanalyst Browder felt like he was kind of similar and had that kinship. But he was endlessly annoyed that Prestwood wouldn't put himself forward, that he just was happy to be in the background. At some point, Presswood invents a new surveying tool. I found a brief mention of it in the newspaper in like 1835. But he never kind of puts himself forward. And so that's a real critique, I think, that the cryptanalyst makes. So I don't know that he ever gets over his shyness in some ways. I mean, something's working for him. Maybe it's just, you know, the patriarchy. But he is clearly like meeting women. But I think he tends to be happier kind of alone and writing and reading most of the time. Yeah.
Was he totally self-educated or?
Yeah, and he's an interesting character because as I read there, he was born in Darlington County, South Carolina. And so he came into a kind of planter class family. So there was some wealth and some money. You know, not massive plantations, but a good bit of land and money. And so he got a pretty good education because of that. Another question that I have no answer to is that for some reason, in 1813, he and his mother leave it all behind. And one of his sisters. They leave his father, they leave all the family wealth. They move to Lenore, North Carolina, or thereabouts, and he starts teaching. And so I don't know what happened to leave all that behind. In some ways, I'm glad. You know, he sort of left. He would have inherited land and enslaved people, and he sort of cut ties with all of that. But I don't know why. He was a captain in the militia during the War of 1812. He's like literally Paul Revereing around. They send him to ride the roads and warn people the British might be coming. So maybe the war was causal in some way. But he was, you know, educated and from a kind of planter class status until he moved to the mountains and really kind of moved in with his mom and just started teaching. Thanks. Yes, sorry.
What do you teach now?
I teach creative writing, primarily nonfiction writing, and that tends to be. And I, as Susan said, I direct our literary festival, which happens every spring. It is nearby. Has anyone been before? Yeah, it's free. It goes on for 4 days, and we bring in about 10 to 12 writers for those 4 days to get public readings and book signings. So you should consider coming over. It'll be April 7th through 10th in 2025. Okay.
Do you have your book here to sell?
Yes, City Lights Bookstore is represented back here in the corner, and they have some books to sell.
So we have very limited copies, but we have another order coming in. It's really Macon County or Jackson County. I can probably deliver it to your house.
Wow, door-to-door service.
Yeah, in Hayesville, that's as far as I'm going. But if you want to take one of our bookmarks and call us and just call the store and say, hey, Matt said you can deliver it to us. We didn't get them here in time, but next week we can probably start delivering them. So.
Yeah. And I'm happy to stop in the store and sign them at some point. Yeah.
Is it possibly on audio?
It's not. But you should write to the publisher and ask. Yeah, people have said that. I feel like that would take so long. I did a radio interview when the book came out, and I read a paragraph, and she had me go back and reread a sentence that I had sort of stumbled over. And I feel like that took 5 minutes just to read one paragraph. So I can't imagine another hours to go into to be an audiobook reader. Thanks so much for being here. I'm happy to chat more and sign the books that are back there. And I really appreciate you singing and listening.